All right, good afternoon and welcome to our virtual Fourth Friday from the Archives. My name is Henry Miller and I'm the Collections Manager here at the Georgia Archives. Today's presentation is People Moving the Land and the Land Moving the People, Georgia's Agricultural and Environmental Past Through the Records Since 1874. It's presented by Dr. John Whitehurst. John has worked as a reference archivist here at the Archives since October of 2021. John was born in Macon and raised in Griffin. He completed a bachelor's degree in Idaho, but returned to Georgia State University to earn a master's degree in history. In 2012, John moved south to attend Florida State University, where he earned a PhD in environmental history in 2019. John has also worked at the National Archives in Atlanta as a history instructor at Gordon State College and worked at the University of Georgia as an agricultural researcher. At UGA, he helped maintain a 9-acre peach orchard that included dozens of peach varieties. Currently, John is working on a Master of Library and Information Science degree at Valdosta State University. John?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Miller. Super excited to be here today and talk about some of the records that we have here at the Georgia Archives. And I apologize for the extremely long title. It's been pointed out to me that maybe I was in school a little bit too long and started making long titles for all my presentations. I do have some goals for my presentation today that I'd like to focus on. I want to provide a general survey of the environmental and agricultural trends in Georgia since the Civil War. I'd also like to describe some of the ways that our records, along with some of those of our neighbors here at the National Archives at Atlanta, or NARA, might be useful to agricultural and environmental historians. And also, throughout this presentation, I want to talk about genealogists, or talk about genealogy a little bit, which is the third part here. I want to try to account for some of the environmental explanations for why people in Georgia are moving around, initially locally, and then we see, of course, more people move regionally and nationally over time. And then finally, I'm going to announce an upcoming event, and that's to keep everybody here, hopefully, a cookie at the end of the presentation. And so I've created a timeline here that I'll go through piece by piece. I'm going to keep coming back to this, so if you don't have a chance to read over it right now, don't worry too much, because I'm going to sort of go one at a time here. And I'm going to start with the 1860s to the 1880s and look at some of the records that we have. For example, we have tax digests that are really good for helping people transition in their genealogy or in their research from the pre-Civil War to post-Civil War period. I'm going to talk about monocropping, just a fancy word for growing one crop at a time, usually a cash crop, and talk about how we did that in Georgia for such a long time and how that affected our environment, both through erosion and the constant need for fertilizer. So the tax digests are one of our most used records here at the Georgia Archives. And they're really good for being able to, again, make the transition from where people are before and after the Civil War. And they can really account for, again, like sort of localized movement. If you're looking for someone who was enslaved before the Civil War, you can often look at tax digests after the Civil War and look at try to find out who they're working for, where they're at, where they're located. And people move around, of course, for different reasons. One of the major reasons people move around is for better wages. It's not all that different than today, but also for changes that happen in the land. And we're going to see this a lot. I'm going to try to highlight that during this presentation, and specifically looking at cotton as a monocrop, as a single crop that was grown over and over. And it did exhaust the land in ways that required people to sort of move around. And that, of course, was favorable to large-scale growers, large-scale landowners, because they could actually grow cotton in one place and then grow on their land and then grow cotton in a different place on their land without having to worry about trying to grow in the same places over and over again, which is really, really hard on the soil. And I will plug my colleague that introduced me here, Dr. Henry Miller. There's a lunch and learn called Migration and Settlement in Early Georgia that you might consider looking into as well if you're interested in why people come to Georgia in the first place. And it is a lot of that is also land-based, of course, and environmental and to some degree. So the start year for my presentation today was 1874, and the reason for that is because Georgia is the first state actually to create a Department of Agriculture. So we were the first. The United States federal government did it in 1862, but Georgia is the first state to do it, and it does it largely in part so as a sort of consumer protection agency, believe it or not. It's sort of, the idea was we're going to need fertilizer because we're farming so much cotton and other things that tend to exhaust the soil. We need to know what fertilizers are best. We need to know that what we're being sold isn't, snake oil per se. Couple of terms I have up here. Soil mining is a term that some people would use for this sort of monocropping nature of things, that you think of miners, they go into the earth, they pull things out that they can't put back in. And that's sort of the idea behind a lot of cotton and tobacco farming. And so one of the things that I've already mentioned, again, is fertilizer usage becomes incredibly important to be able to continue to grow these types of crops. And so fertilizer this time is organic. It's not something we can just make out of a lab somewhere from other products. So we have to get it from other places. Another approach, though, is what's called crop rotation. And you can do things like plant clover to put, put the nutrients back in the soil. And then, of course, there are rotations of crops that people have historically used. I think with cotton, it's soybeans and corn, and then back to cotton a lot of times. This record that I've highlighted here is an example of some of the early records for the Department of Agriculture. And it is just an example of, again, how the department is going through and looking at different fertilizers, and we'll come back to that actually. So I mentioned erosion. Erosion is a big issue for Georgia and most everywhere in the Piedmont area of the state and throughout the Southeast, actually. And we have a wonderful example of this in Georgia called Providence Canyon down in Stewart County. If you're looking at the picture on the left, I can't really point it out to you, although maybe my mouse will let me. Yeah, here we go. This little group, this little cluster right here, these are actually people. So that puts the scale of that photo into context maybe a little bit better. That really shows you how much erosion had happened by this time. And this is actually, we believe, the earliest known photo of Providence Canyon. It's taken sometime in the 1890s, we believe. So again, just a great example of the problems that we can have from erosion if we don't do anything about it. A lesser known gully in Georgia that I thought was really fascinating when I was doing research for this project is called Lyell Gully. And if you've ever heard of the name Lyell, you may have heard of Charles Lyell. He was a very important geologist who actually influenced Charles Darwin, because he had all these sort of arguments about how it took a long time for the Earth to have these sort of changes in its environment and its natural landscapes. And he came to Georgia in the 1840s and visited a gully, or a series of gullies just outside of Milledgeville. So we actually have a gully named after Charles Lyell. That is not him in the photograph, unfortunately. I can't imagine it is, at least, because that photograph was taken much later than his visit. So one of the things you might ask yourself if you're looking at these photos is, well, where does all this land go? We see that it's not here. We see that it's not in these pictures, and it ends up in our rivers, and it silts up the rivers, and a lot of times creates flooding and things like that. If you read some of the earlier documents in our state, you'll see where grist mills and different things, water wheels will get covered up by this silting effect. So what do we do about it? Early on, there are efforts for terracing, and also what's called sometimes horizontal planting or plowing. So instead of going, obviously, if you plow and you till up and down a hillside, that's just going to increase water erosion. And so we know we get heavy rains here in the Southeast. The photograph on the right, just real quickly, comes from our Mines, Mining, and Geology collection, and that's on our virtual vault. There's a lot of good photographs of Georgian nature in that collection if you're interested. So guano is what one of our major fertilizers is going to be until we get sort of synthetic fertilizers. Guano is bat feces. In the spirit of Halloween, have to bring in the bats. And we did have a guano industry in Georgia in the sense that it was taking guano from, we were getting guano from South and Central America. There's a whole very interesting international history of guano. And we were providing it to our farmers here in Georgia. On the left there, both of these are from Coweta County, both of these photos. On the left there is a place where they're selling guano, where they sold guano. and other farm implements. And on the right is a typical spreader for guano. If that looks familiar to you, because your current spreader that you use on your turf grass or lawn maybe looks something like that, they're not all that different, at least in my novice opinion. You can sort of see how that works. So guano, again, is used from the 1840s up until the 19-teens. As far as the records we have here, we do have a lot of lawsuits who mention guano companies, the companies who distributed that. They're usually going after people who didn't make their payments and things like that. So all this sort of changes, though, in the 19-teens, because there is what is called the Haber-Bosch synthesis. There's a German chemist, and he's actually the father of chemical warfare as well, but we won't talk about that as much today. But he actually learned how to sort of take nitrogen and turn it into ammonium. And so by doing that, he created synthetic fertilizer. And this feeds about half the world today. So you can look around, and half of us are probably here because of this guy, in a sense. Again, he also created a bunch of chemical warfare. So he's got a mixed legacy. And so by the 19-teens, we start to see a shift from guano to synthetic fertilizers. And if you look to the document on the right there, this is a great example of what the Department of Agriculture is doing. You can see here they've got Armor Fertilizer Works. They're analyzing different fertilizers that are being sold. And if you're familiar with fertilizer, you know your NPK, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They're telling you here, this is what they're saying is in this product. This is what we found. And so this is a great example again, so the farmers aren't buying the wrong products. And so the Department of Agriculture is sort of founded on this and continues to do so with different things over time, which we'll see. So our second area here, second part of the timeline, from the 1880s to the 19-teens, I'll talk briefly about land grant universities. This is a federal thing that affects each state, soil surveys, and then this concept of the New South and what that means for agriculture. The first thing I should point out is that, in a sense, this is outside of the timeline I've created, because the actual land grant colleges, the first land grant colleges in the United States, are created out of the same act that creates the United States Department of Agriculture I mentioned earlier in 1862. And in Georgia, that first land grant college that we got is the University of Georgia. In 1890, the federal government passed a second act. The first one's called the Morrill Act, and there was a second Morrill Act in 1890, and that basically said you can do one of two things in the South. You can integrate your colleges, which we know did not happen for much longer, or for quite a ways down the road, or you can create a second land grant college for African American students. So we have the creation of the first Black land grant college here in Georgia as well, at Savannah State College, now Savannah State University. And it stays there until 1942, and it becomes that status moves to Fort Valley State University then. As far as where I got these images here, the middle one is from our historic postcard collection, and the ones on the end are from our large print collection. And these are not actually on the virtual vault. If you want to find photographs that are not on the virtual vault that we have, we do have a database that you can access on site. And I can show you how to do that later if that's something anybody's interested in. And so, yeah, these are great places to get photos if you're looking for that sort of thing. One of my favorite records that we have here is actually a collaborative. It was a record that came out of a collaborative effort between the United States Department of Agriculture, the Georgia Department of Agriculture, and the University System of Georgia. So between 1899 and 1950, the USDA and various states, especially southern states who realized erosion was a huge problem, they really needed to understand the soil better. So they created what we call the National Cooperative Soil Surveys. And if you see all the various colors that are in that map there, those represent different soil types. Now, these are not the same soil types you would come across today for my soil scientists. If anybody's listening, don't attack me on this, hopefully. But this is the beginning of that field, in the sense of we're going to classify various soils. We're going to try to understand them better so we can know where to plant, know where not to plant. This is Stewart County that we're looking at, which I mentioned earlier because of Providence Canyon. And I'll do a close-up here of Providence Canyon on that map. We have 54 of these on our virtual vault. If that's something you want to find, you can get to our virtual vault. Again, we can show you how to do that if you'd like. and just type in soil survey. You'll get 53 results. There's one county that's shared. I think it's Henry and Butts. So, and again, just one of the more interesting, I think, the records that are produced in terms of agricultural records and trying to understand how do we use the earth. And this is a close-up of Providence Canyon, and that sort of tannish color there, right here where it says Patterson Hills. We've got this RO. I've got the key over here, rough gullied land. So not great for farming, obviously. Rough gullied land. And you can see here a second part of this that I'll mention is this is the road that you still drive, or at least it's close to, if not the same road that you drive in on if you visited Providence Canyon. Providence Canyon is actually named after, I believe, either the church or the school, or I think it's the church. And so this is also a good example for genealogists who are looking for, at the turn of the century or around this time period, if you're looking for a place, a church, a school, a community that maybe wasn't big enough to be on other maps, these maps often will have those details. So this is something that's also useful in that sense. Here's a nice aerial of Providence Canyon. This is again from our Mines, Mining, and Genealogy collection. And it really gives you a sense of why we call it Georgia's Little Grand Canyon. So again, that collection is fantastic. That is on the virtual vault. And then I'll talk just briefly about New South ideals in agriculture. So if you study Southern history, or if you're familiar with this idea of the New South, this comes out as sort of out of the Civil War. And it is an idea that maybe the South should start to industrialize a little more. And there's a lot of things that I'd have to unpack, but I'm going to talk briefly about how this affects agriculture. And four of the ways it does this is moving towards industrialization within agriculture. And I would just point out that, we kind of have a tendency to think like, okay, people farm and then they go take a job in a mill, and those two things never touch. But actually, as we know, agriculture becomes more industrialized over time, and that's part of what happens during this period. We also see a shift from monocropping, as we've talked about, like cotton and tobacco, cash crops, to diversification. So farmers start to think we should grow different things. We should grow crops that maybe we can rotate crops, for example, or we can grow something that maybe is worth more, like a specialty crop, which is my third point here. And then the fourth point we'll come back to in a minute, using science to understand agriculture. We've already seen this a little bit with the establishment of land grant colleges, but it's going to happen again over time. It's going to happen more and more. So peaches, right? Here we are in Georgia, the peach state. We've got peaches on our license plates. We've got them on our driver's license. Justin Bieber gets his peaches down in Georgia. So yeah, we've got to talk about peaches. This is a great example of a shift from cotton to a specialty crop, or a shift from monocropping to specialty crops. During this time period, Georgia becomes more and more interested in having and studying horticulture and plant breeding, and you start to see again this shift towards toward crops like the peach. You don't have to plant every year. In some ways, they're less labor intensive. In other ways, not so much. But again, this is a great example of the shift that we're talking about. Sometimes you'll hear historians talk about this as a shift from planters to farmers as well, and that it's sort of this. There's a sense that we're moving away from those old South ideas about plantations and moving towards something a little more, in a sense, industrialized. Now, the Alberta peach is the Georgia peach, and the reason it is the peach that we normally see, even though most of us maybe don't know that name, is there was a gentleman in Marshallville, Georgia, by the name of Samuel Rumpf, and he bred this peach. He named it after his first wife, and he even created, and this is a great example of these ideas, he even created crates that he could ship these in up north. And so the name of the game starts to become, how do we breed better crops? How do we get them out earlier in the season and make more money? How do we sustain them? How do we keep them from, hurting each other when we pack them, and all this sort of stuff? This image here is taken from the Georgia Historical and Industrial, and I'll come back later and talk about that just a little bit. That's a publication that we have that's fantastic if you're looking to understand sort of a snapshot of turn of the century Georgia. A couple of peach pictures here. The one on the top left is from our Vanishing Georgia collection. And as you can see here, this is when people are picking. Everybody's got a bucket here. And if this is something, this is something you still see obviously today, and it's kind of an interesting. And then the bottom right here is the packing house. If you've been to any of the peach places today, this is something they like to put on display a lot of times. And I use these. I think they're a good example of sort of the division of labor and things like that are happening at the time. This bottom right picture of workers packing peaches in a peach packing shed is the title. Comes from our government record prints collection, which again is one of those collections that you can access the database on site if you want to look through and see what kind of photos we have. It's a great collection. Okay, so when we talk about science getting more involved in a sense in agriculture, the Hatch Act of 1887 is a great example of this. This is not to be confused with the Hatch Act that state workers aren't to talk about politics and sort of do all that kind of stuff. That's a different Hatch. But the Hatch Act of 1887 establishes experiment stations in each state, and so this happens in 1888 for Georgia. The Georgia station, or the experiment station, as it's often called, is established right outside of Griffin, Georgia, sort of an enclave in Griffin named Experiment. And of course, that's the Piedmont. That's red clay type soils. And so what happens is, over time, people in Georgia say, it's great that we can study things there, but we have this place, we have the coastal plains too. That's very different. The land is different down here. So maybe we should have a place as well. So in 1919, the Coastal Plains Station is established in Tifton, Georgia. And in 1950, Athens gets its own as well, named College Station. And we have the annual reports for each of these with some gaps in them. And some of these are also available on HathiTrust, and I believe also on government publications, which I can talk about a little bit later as well, or at least give you I'm going to plug another one of my colleagues for that one. All right, so one of the records that I came across was a publication actually that was recommended to me by former Deputy Director Steve Angeron. This was a fantastic record again for if you're trying to understand sort of a snapshot, get an idea of where's Georgia in 1900. In 1901, there's what's called the Georgia Historical and Industrial. And this is produced by the Department of Agriculture. It's about 1,000 pages. It's a hefty book. But it includes all sorts of interesting information, mostly not all agricultural actually, but a lot of it agricultural and environmental. It has a lot of great maps. Some of them they show the soil conditions, they show climate, temperature, geology, rain, and sort of different places where different tree types grow. It talks about our public roads, it talks about our railroads. It gives an overview of education and educational institutions in Georgia. It talks about the various religious denominations in the state. And one of my favorite parts, it talks about counties. It gives a 1 to 3 page county sketch. And these actually have some pretty interesting information in them. If you ever we have people come in all the time, genealogists that say, I want to know what it was like for my ancestor who lived in this place. And these may not necessarily give you the day-to-day activities that they're doing, but it will give you kind of a general overview. So some of the maps are sort of, again, I mentioned these 3 already. But we've got a rain map here in the center, a forestry map, and then the one on the far left is kind of a real generalized soil map. So it's the big version of what we looked at earlier. Obviously a lot less detailed, but still gives you an idea of the Piedmont, coastal plains, that type of thing. County sketches. So I picked a county that I'm from here, Spalding County, and these are really nice because they talk even about how much people own as a community. And you'll see here they've actually even segregated these numbers, and so you get a sort of a demographic. You get an idea of demographics as well. It talks about how many men, how many women, how many white people, how many African American people. It talks about how much people own, and there's all sorts of neat things in here. It talks about what they're growing in some sections of this as well. It talks about if you have major schools or things like that. It talks about the natural boundaries of the places and things like that. So all kinds of fun information to be had from that particular source. My third group here, we'll talk just briefly about from the 19 teens to the 30s. This is when we start to see a lot of invasive insects, invasive species. I can explain that a little more in a second. We start to see more synthetic fertilizers being used and increased state regulation, partly as a response to both those first two things. So the boll weevil, we can't talk about agricultural history in Georgia or the Southeast without the boll weevil, of course. The boll weevil gets to Georgia about 1914, 1915, and it's not something we did not, we knew it was coming. And so real quickly, an invasive species, my definition that I'm going to use, probably oversimplified, is a non-native species that is going to displace something that you already have in your area, typically a native species. That's maybe not the best definition, but that's what's going to have to get us through today. And I think that the poster on the left is a great example of just how serious this was. So a lot of people have noted that, a lot of historians have noted that this is a lot of this stuff is turned like in terms of warfare. It's framed in terms of warfare. So if you look at that poster, it's pretty reminiscent of World War I posters and sort of things like that. And it's telling the people of Macon and Atlanta, hey, you need to grow some different crops this year because you're going to get wiped out on your cotton. It's happening. This is 1914. If you look at the map on the right, 1914 is that last line there. And so, again, we see that this is going to happen. We see that it's coming, and people have to prepare for it. And just to give you an idea of what this actually does, between 1914 and the mid-1920s, it wipes out about half of Georgia's cotton. So people start shifting in what they're growing, which they've already started to do, but this really is a push for that. Okay, we also have publications that talk about this in our collection quite a bit, actually, and this is taken from one of them on the right here, where it says, as stated above, the weevil reached in the fall of 1913, right at the beginning, right before World War I here, a point about 6 miles from the Georgia line. It extends its range on an average of 65 miles per year. We may infer from this that this weevil will enter the extreme western part of Georgia during the season of 1914, which it did, and again wiped out quite a bit of cotton. A second invasive that we don't talk as much about is the Texas fever cattle tick, and this is something that really kept the Southeast from being able to be sort of ranching country for quite a while. And so there is a law passed in 1909 that to protect the livestock from this tick that carries a bacteria which causes Texas fever in the cattle. And if you're ever looking for Georgia laws, Georgia legislative documents is a great place to go, although it may not be around for very much longer. But there is also another plug I'll put here. If you're interested in looking at laws even outside of Georgia, there are a couple websites that you can use here. One is Hine Online that you can access here at the Georgia Archives, and also Government Publications is another good one. And I'll plug again another YouTube video that we have on our channel, Archives and Genealogy Day 2022. Georgia Archives staff presents search tools that you can use, and that will actually show you how to use Hine Online and Government Publications. Okay, so one of the other things that happens during this period is that pesticides and insecticides become more important. We have to figure out what we're going to do about this boll weevil, right? And so this is a great example from the Department of Agriculture entomology department. And I always just like to point this out because if you look at that list of insecticides right there and fungicides, lead arsenate, calcium arsenate, magnesium arsenate, these are broad-based pesticides. They kill everything just about that they touch. And so we learned pretty quickly, or maybe not quickly, but we learned from this eventually that if you kill everything, you kill the good and the bad, and then something else replaces it. So this is going to be a problem later on, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes here. There is a nice little plate on the right here that shows you sort of the types of equipment that people use to spray insecticides, pesticides. The knapsack sprayer, that probably, if that reminds you of your backpack sprayer, it's really similar. It's just not plastic, right? It has the hand pump. The barrel pump we'll come back to in a second, and then the power sprayer at the bottom. So these are actually not all that different. I mean, they are very different in the sense that what we use today runs off of fuel and all those sorts of things. But again, you can see some similarities in just the way this equipment looks. This is a great example of the pump spray, the barrel pump sprayer here. This is a peach orchard, as you can see. There's a trailer being drawn by horses or possibly mules here. And you've got two guys on the back, or in the field. They're actually spraying the trees, and then the guy on the barrel, he's just pumping. And so kind of a nice example of what that looks like, and the intensity of what it takes to keep an orchard up, of course. Went in from the 1930s to the 1960s. We'll just talk very quickly about New Deal agriculture, what that means for the South, what that means for Georgia, how our records represent that, and then also mechanization of farming. So 4 things, and I'm only going to cover really 2 of these in detail, as we see an increase in demand for people from people for food and drug regulations, and that is part of the sort of comes out of some of the problems that people have from getting bad food or bad drugs. Some of it's a response to the prohibition and things like that, because people were drinking all sorts of strange things. But that's a whole other story. I'll talk a little bit about that, show some records that we have. We'll also look very quickly at our examining board records. So a lot of those start in this time period. And those are sort of interesting because, again, you have the idea that now you can't just, to do this job, you may need training. So we're going to have training, we're going to have regulation, things like that. Synthetic fertilizers, I'll mention again. And then I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but it's important to note in the timeline that this is the period where poultry starts to replace cotton in Georgia. And some of that is a response to New Deal legislation. And again, that's something that today we'll come back to that, but that's an important part of our state's output currently. Here's an example of food and drugs. The Food and Drugs Department within the Georgia Department of Agriculture. And I'm not picking on Athens here because this exists for a lot of places. But as you can see here, you've got different products, samples that were taken, and then issues that were present in those products. Sweet milk, I just recently learned, is what we usually call milk. I guess buttermilk is sort of sour, so people would call milk sweet milk. And as you can see here, this sweet milk at the top is a great example of something that was pulled off the shelf, essentially. And it was the bacteria count is relatively high. Bacterial count high, no dirt should be found. No kidding. Fat below standard. So they're skimming their product here in some way or another, probably. And so, yeah, you see that listed with all these here. So again, this is a great example of the Department of Agriculture sort of helping out us as consumers. The examining boards are some of my favorite records, actually. If you had, and speaking to the genealogists out there again, if you had somebody who was a barber or was a pesticide applicator, or there's so many different examining boards, it's possible that we could have where they were approved for that license, or believe it or not, where they might not have gotten the license that they tried to get. There's not a lot of genealogical value in these necessarily, but it's just one of those records I like to mention to people. We do see a lot of funny things in these. I love seeing why people get called on the carpet, essentially. What did they do, or what did they get accused of? So these can be kind of neat for that too. But a great example overall of this, of how the Department of Agriculture and eventually Secretary of State gets more involved in sort of regulating that. Something I'll mention very quickly, and this speaks more to the records of our neighbors here at the National Archives probably, but as we have federal legislation, New Deal legislation that gets put out, we also see at the same time what we call the Great Migration, where a lot of people are packing up and they're leaving the South for better jobs. We've, a lot of times we associate this with African Americans who leave to avoid racial violence. And something I have to mention is that this is also a period where a lot of people lose their farms. We know that probably about 60% of white farmers lose their farms during this time period. About 80% of African American farmers do. And part of this is part of the story is the ability to get loans. And again, we've got federal records next door that speak to that. And part of it is also about farming becomes such a capital intensive endeavor. You have to be able to invest. So this picture here is a great example of that. This is from, again, our Vanishing Georgia collection. This farmer purchased, according to the field notes, he purchased this tractor and equipment based on a federal loan. So that becomes more and more the case of, are you going to be able to still continue to farm? Do you have credit, or can you get credit? So good example of that. And then moving into our last period here, just talk briefly about the environmental movement, how that affects agriculture, sort of the notions of ecology that come out of that. And then one of my favorite parts, how we market our crops, how we market our agricultural output in the state. So the environmental movement is in large part due to Rachel Carson, who writes a book in 1962 called Silent Spring. And this leads to a lot of questions about the use of pesticides. I mentioned earlier that when we looked at those pesticides, they're broad-based pesticides. They're killing a lot of different things. And so, and they're also having, sort of adverse effects on sometimes people, sometimes animals. And so this book in particular leads to the pesticide ban on DDT. And it also sort of puts pressure for pesticides to be more direct. We're going to go from the hatchet to the scalpel, right? And start to make pesticides that actually target a specific species and things like that. Another federal response to this movement is the creation of APHIS, which really speaks back to our boll weevil and our Texas fever tick problems. The acronym is Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. It's established in 1972. And if you go travel somewhere today and you're wondering why they won't let you bring the fruit that you got back home to Georgia, this is part of the reason why. And then I'll go back to this in a second, but I want to talk quickly about the commodity commissions and what that means. But I just want to point out that Georgia, sort of what happens here reflects that national movement that I'm talking about with the pesticide bans and APHIS. In 1972, the state passes the Georgia Pesticide Use and Application Act, and eventually, starts to adopt more and more programs that will keep, invasive species out of the state. And also, I'll come back to this, but the commodity commissions start to find out what are the best ways to market our products to other places. So the commodity commissions are really fun records. They're also Department of Agriculture records in the commissioner's office. And in the 60s and 70s, a lot of farmers get together and decide, let's figure out the best ways to sort of promote our product. My favorite one over here is on the peanut farmers, and they're talking about, they're so excited because Women's Day magazine is going to carry one of the biggest peanut publicity breaks that, quote, we have had to date in our national promotion. It is an 8-page cookbook devoted entirely to peanut butter. Now, I looked for this and I was unable to find it. I'd have to buy that magazine on eBay, unfortunately, but sign me up because that sounds wonderful. 8 pages about peanut butter. But yeah, this is a great example of being, sort of interactive with the community and finding ways to market your product. The the Milk Commission is in the center there. I picked that one mainly because I love the cover. And then the Peach Commission, of course, I'm biased about peaches, so I threw that one in there as well. And these groups, again, they're writing the Department of Agriculture. They're working with the Department of Agriculture. And then I started with cotton, so we'll go full circle and come back to cotton really quickly. The boll weevil is something that stays a problem for a while. And I mentioned that it wiped out about half of the state's cotton within 10 years of its arrival here. And so in the 80s, we have, this is from the Commodity Commission for cotton. We have the Commodity Commission saying, look, we need to create a program. We support a program of boll weevil eradication. And this actually does, to some degree, work. If you've been to South Georgia in recent times, you've seen the amount of cotton that we now grow again. And a lot of this is due to things like APHIS and what's called integrated pest management, which is essentially going beyond chemical pesticides exclusively and looking at other ways that you can grow cotton and reduce pests, essentially. So another good example of that. And then I'll just end with the 5 Ps of Georgia. I feel like everybody needs to know these. If you don't learn anything else or remember anything else today, maybe this is the big takeaway: is that Georgia has 5 products we're really proud of. The first 3 are going to be, we're actually the top producer in the country, and that's poultry, peanuts, pecans. And so top producer for those. Peaches, we're number 3. Doesn't matter. It's our identity. It's important to us. And number 3 is not so bad, right? And then 5 is actually sort of controversial. It's usually it's usually pulpwood or paper, and we do have commissions for that too here in the records. But some people say it's people, and so I'm gonna be a little cheesy and just say we produce fantastic people here in the state, and stick with that. And the last record I have here is from the Department of Agriculture, just a newsletter that was produced in the 70s. And this is a great example, again, of going from the commissions to international trade. And then this is the Georgia's Agricultural International Trade newsletter. It talks about how what the commissions are doing to get the word out there to places like in this particular document. It talks about Switzerland and how they're eating corn grits, turnip greens, black-eyed peas, and hush puppies. So now that you're all hungry, I'll just share real quickly. These are the collections that I used for this presentation, and I won't. You can always come back to this in the recorded version, hopefully. Again, next door, there's a lot of records that if you're interested in agricultural and environmental history that they have over there, that could be very useful. And I say all this for the big announcement I promised at the end, and that is that April 1st, we are going to have the Georgia Archives Symposium, and this year's theme is going to be Georgia, nature, and the environment. So if I got everything wrong today, this is a great opportunity for you to come present. If I got some things right and you found a topic you're interested in, please submit a proposal for this. And if you just are interested in stuff that had nothing to do with anything I talked about today, I promise we have lots of other records that are really useful here, and we'll have some of those listed in our proposal. That'll be available on our website. And then here are some of my secondary sources. I'll fly through these again and come back to them later if you like. And with that, I'd like to just open it up to any questions anybody might have.
Hey, John, we've got a question going back to this earlier part of the presentation. Where did they get the guano that they were using as fertilizer?
Great question. Mostly, my understanding is it mostly came from Central and South American countries. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this was sort of this was a major tension between the United States and some of those countries because we tried to get the guano the best ways we could, most effective ways we could. So.
Okay. We have another question from the chat. Many counties stopped producing peaches in the 1920s to 1930s. Was this because of the Depression, the textile industry, or disease, or are there other reasons?
That is a good question. I don't know. 20s and 30s, decline in peaches. I'm not sure if I'm familiar enough with the history to know. I mean, I'm thinking of like things like nematodes and problems like that. There's a lot of peach breeding that happens. I know later that makes it easier, or makes the peach trees more resilient. But some of the other things that were indicated there might be, again, that's not far from that period where a lot of people were losing farms. So it would not surprise me if that's a big part of it too. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure though, to be honest.
Just a couple people typing in the chat. So just another second or two.
I'm thinking curculio. I don't know. I'll think about that. Maybe I can come back and get a better answer to the peach problem. Sure, I can find it. There's a good secondary source called The Georgia Peach by Tom Oakey. If whoever asked that is interested, that's a great book for that.
All right. We've got another question from the chat. It says in the topograph of Providence Canyon, Orangeburg sand was noted as a feature of the landscape. Any source on that term?
I don't have a source on it, but I would definitely, I'm going to throw out secondary source on this again. Paul Sutter's book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Gullies. He talks a lot about how those maps were constructed what went into them, why they were classifying those types of soil for with those names. It might be in there. Because he does talk about like why they were named some of those strange terms, and there was a lot of debate about whether that was good science or not at the time as well. Good question. Thank you.
Okay, we've got another question from the chat. Maybe we'll give another few moments after this question for one more after this one, or we'll just have this as the last one. But did the guano sellers end up moving to selling synthetic fertilizers?
So I want to first say I really appreciate the guano questions because I think that's the best one. That's probably one of the most interesting parts as well. Yeah, I think so. Well, you can look at one of the records I didn't highlight today that I kind of wanted to, but I didn't do it. Are corporations essentially get their charters? I'm not sure if I'm using the right terminology there, but yeah, a lot of these companies we have paperwork for when they start. And yes, I do believe because a lot of these, you see this a lot where it's like the guano, like the Spalding County Guano Company, and guano and mechanical, and so those companies would sell not just guano a lot of times, but equipment. And I'm assuming I would assume that they would also sort of shift into the synthetic fertilizers as well. I most certainly would think so. I mean, there's probably wouldn't surprise me if there's still a guano company out there today. I don't know of one, but who knows? That would be a fun thing to look up.
All right, and I believe this will be our last question. Jordan from UGA was wondering if there were any records in the Georgia archives that talked about the popularity of the Farmers Alliance in the 1880s and 90s and the rise of agrarian populism in the South during that time period.
Good question, Jordan, and also hi, if it's the Jordan I'm thinking of, and if not, hi as well. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with any records, but I would definitely say we have records here that reflect the populist movement, and a lot of the Department of Agriculture records get into that as well. We had some kind of infamous / famous populist candidates that came out of the state of Georgia as well. But yeah, I would definitely say we would probably have quite a bit. At least we would have some of that within the correspondence of what's going on, and that maybe even in honestly governor's correspondence and things like that, because that movement was such a influential movement on both parties, I believe.
All right. Well, thank you, John, for presenting a very informative lecture today, and thank you all for attending. This Fourth Friday program complements our monthly Lunch and Learn series and our several special events throughout the year, which John mentioned. Our symposium coming up in April is one of those. You can find out more about all of our programs on our website, georgiaarchives.org. And further, this and many of our programs are recorded and available on our YouTube channel. And the easiest way to get to that is to go to georgiaarchives.org, and there's a little link to the YouTube channel there. If you had any other questions about the records John highlighted or any of our other records here at the Georgia Archives, we welcome you to use our Ask an Archivist feature, once again available on the main page of our website, georgiaarchives.org. Thank you all for attending and have a great afternoon.